been trying to understand the relationship between Christian Europe, let's say, and the dawn of the scientific age for a long time. And so let me outline something for you, and then I'll turn back to exactly what you said. So it seems to me, I mean, much of the early science was done in the monasteries that turned into universities. And so there's certainly a trail from Christianity through the monasteries to the universities. And so you can think about that as concrete evidence of the underpinning of much of the scientific revolution in terms of at least the offshoots of Christianity. But I think there's something deeper there. And so I've tried to make this case with Dawkins, for example, not least after he called himself a cultural Christian. So it seems to me that for science to get going as a motivational project, there are some assumptions you have to make that aren't scientific. So there are axioms before the game gets going. And I think they're faith-based axioms. One is that the cosmos is intelligible, that it's intelligible to the human mind, and that diligent investigation of that intelligibility produces an increment in knowledge, both conceptual and practical, and that increment in knowledge is good. But then there's maybe a deeper presumption, which is that increment in knowledge can be good if the point of the knowledge pursuit remains encapsulated in something like the underlying Christian ethos. And then I would say that fractures in a way, perhaps Bacon's a turning point, where the reliance of the scientific endeavor on these metaphysical presuppositions is questioned. Or like when I presented Dawkins with that argument, he just waved his hands over it. He said he doesn't have any metaphysical assumptions underlying his brand of science. And I think that is what the more radical Enlightenment French Revolution types thought, is that no, we've escaped from the underlying religious ethos. Okay, the problem with that is, it seems to me, and I think this might have to do with this apocalyptic kickback, is that once you unmoor yourself from the underlying ethos, which is even the ethos that defines what constitutes knowledge and progress itself, then the Luciferian element of the scientific endeavor can begin to loom extremely large.
Well, again, let's start with the early modern history, and I'm always a sort of hardcore Girardian, this great thinker, intellectual, sort of in some ways Christian polymath that I studied under Stanford in the late '80s, '90s, and influenced me tremendously. And these things are, again, very complicated intellectual history questions, but certainly one intuition that's odd about your telling would be that you would say that we had sort of a law-centered monotheistic tradition, also in Islam, also in Judaism, and if we say there was something about Christianity that where this really came, and it was not in the Islamic world that you got the scientific revolution, for example. It suggests that maybe it wasn't just the metaphysics, not just the theological metaphysics that drove it, but something like the Christian anthropology. Girard was fond of always saying that people focus too much in the Bible on what it tells us about God, but there must also be something it tells us about man. About man.
Yeah. Okay.
And certainly the Girardian intuition is that one of the things is always that there's this really big problem of violence and scapegoating, and that in some ways, some sense Judaism and then Christianity, it's the same story. It's the same story of sacrifice, but it's told not from the point of view of the violent community. It's told from the point of view of the innocent victim, and there's a certain way where it sets in process this gradual, this dynamic revelation that leads to this sort of gradual unraveling. And as you stop believing in scapegoats, you're forced to come up with other explanations, and that includes science. So, for example, you can ask, why did the witchcraft trials come to an end? And the atheist scientific explanation is we got science to prove that witchcraft is impossible. And I don't think that's even been proven in 2025 because we don't know everything. Maybe it's a lost art that's been lost. Maybe you can go to a bookstore in Berkeley,
There's not a
buy
lot
a
of
book on
difference
how to be a
between
witch.
placebo effect and magic.
And so that, but then the Girardian alternate story of why the witchcraft trials ended were that at some point people realized that this sort of collective scapegoating in some ways was like a version of the death of Christ. The witches were not absolutely innocent like Christ, but they were relatively innocent. It was a community that went crazy. And then and then once you know that the witches are innocent or are relatively innocent, then you steel yourself and force yourself to find natural explanations. If you don't think that it was, I don't know, the Jews that poisoned the wells in the Middle Ages, eventually,
Or some devils,
eventually, this was during the Salem witch trials. There were these, you had these competing sermons on Sundays, and the initial ones were sort of these women had made a pact with the devil, but then the way it got reconstructed, because it was right afterwards that the witchcraft trials ended, and people sort of realized pretty fast they'd kind of collectively lost their minds. And the alternate one was, no, the devil had entered the whole community and had possessed all of Salem. And those were the sermons you gave in the aftermath of the witchcraft trials. And then in that sort of a context, maybe science was also a way to find, you can steel yourself to find natural explanations. When you're in an archaic, thing, scapegoating is always an explanation. It's this person did this, that person did this, it's that person's fault. And when you say those explanations won't do, maybe you're forced to do
Right. So I
scientific
wonder if
explanations.
that was-
So there are all these different threads one can stress.
I wonder if that was also-
I think you have to always ask this question: what was specific about the Christian message that really enabled this? I think there was a way the Jewish context was extremely learned, and people, I don't know if you compare the Talmudic abilities already in the Middle Ages to understand the Bible, to read it, it was as good or better than anything that the Christian scholastics were doing. But somehow it never really got a part of society to orient in this other way.
So,
But again, it's obviously a complicated history.
well, so one of the things you pointed out there that's very interesting is that Christianity, the rise of Christianity destroyed the pagan world, and that's a great mystery. But one of the epistemological consequences of that was the notion that deities weren't widespread. That idea had to disappear. The Romans had gods for their archways, right? So there was an idea that there were invisible spirits, so to speak, that were operating behind the scenes that could easily be interpreted as causal mechanisms. But you can imagine then, I'm also trying to integrate this with what I learned from Jung. You can imagine that as the world's desacralized at the pagan level, and the kinds of interpretations that you just described are no longer tenable, right? There are these invisible agencies, some of them personalities that are operating, that isn't working anymore. That gets all aggregated into a monotheistic deity, and the magic gets pulled out of the world. See, Jung also pointed out that as the Christian revolution transpired, the alchemical mythology started to become widespread, and that there was a idea that developed that there were mysteries lurking in the material world that had redemptive capacity. And so you could imagine that as the spirits are taken out of the world, the suspicion, you already said this, the suspicion that there are other causal forces at work starts to make itself manifest in at least the imaginations of people who are on the cutting edge. And so I wonder if is that a inevitable consequence of the victory of Christianity over the pagan world? Because it gets desacralized. merely because everything that's divine gets united into a single